Hello and welcome to this special series on the Goa Inquisition. The series introduces you to the most recent research produced by internationally recognized scholars. I am Dale Luis Menezes. Our guests will give you a glimpse of their research as well as the research that has taken place over the last half century. You will hear directly from the experts about the nature of state and religious violence, as well as the challenges a historian faces in researching a difficult topic such as the history of the Inquisition. Our web series aims to educate the general public about the various aspects of this historical phenomena. The web series is supported by the Al-Zulaij collective in Goa. Additionally, the series is also supported by the History of the Inquisitions group, a group of scholars spread across the world with institutional support from the Center for Religious History Studies at the Catholic University of Portugal and of the chair of the Sephardic Studies, Alberto Benveniste, at the University of Lisbon. We thank them all for their generous moral support. Our guest today is Professor Bruno Feitler. Professor Feitler has a PhD in history from the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, Paris. He teaches early modern history at the Universidade Federal de São Paulo in Brazil. He is a specialist in the history of the Portuguese conversos or New Christians and the history of the Catholic Church, and particularly the Inquisition in the Portuguese Empire. He has authored many scholarly articles as well as books such as Nas Malhas da Consciência, Igreja e Inquisição no Brasil, which was published in 2007, and The Imaginary Synagogue, Anti-Jewish Literature in the Portuguese Early Modern World, which was published in 2015. Professor Feitler, welcome.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Let me begin by the first question pertaining to the fact that you're a Brazilian scholar interested or doing work in on the history of the Goan Inquisition. The thing is that towards the end of the last decade, some of us in Goa who were interested in good scholarly writings on the Inquisition started hearing that some scholars in Brazil were writing about the Inquisition, the Goan Inquisition. I actually have been hearing your name for quite some time now, so it's a double pleasure for me to talk to you here. To us, it seemed a bit strange that scholars in distant Brazil were interested in the topic. Could you let us know why scholars in Brazil got interested in writing about the Goa Inquisition?
Oh, it's a very interesting question. When we start studying some topics, we don't always meditate a lot about this. But well, there is one thinking now about this. I think we can separate this in two different levels. One thing that Brazil and Goa were both colonies of Portugal. And after studying the activity of the Portuguese Inquisition in Brazil, it would be interesting to have a comparative, a paragon with another territory, another colonial Portuguese territory. And of course, there are dozens of huge differences between Brazil and Goa, right? Regarding the culture, regarding the local population, etc. But it would have been maybe this possibility of comparing, maybe not so the repression and the people that were persecuted, but how the Inquisition acted. How the Inquisition acted in Brazil and Goa, or in the Estado da Índia, in Portuguese Asia, could be compared in certain ways. So this is one of the reasons why Brazilians specialized in the Inquisition would get interested in studying the Inquisition in Goa. And the other thing is that it's more curious maybe, but is the fact that in the National Library in Rio de Janeiro, the main national library in Brazil, we have a very important set of documents related to the Goa Inquisition. In fact, are the only surviving documents of the original archives of the Goa Inquisition. They are kept in the National Brazilian Library in Rio de Janeiro. So nowadays they are, we can access that online, but this is possible only since two years ago, more or less. So beforehand, I mean, if we like maybe 10 years ago, or 10 or 15 years ago, going to the National Library, if I made a research Inquisition, the main thing that would appear would be the Goa Inquisition. So of course I would go and start looking at that, and that would also be one of the reasons why people would start studying the Goa Inquisition being in Brazil.
Right, and what we have here is, one was that the connect with the former empire, and the other was that the sources, the documents were surviving, documents had survived in Janeiro. So that brings me to my second question. You wrote about these archives that survived in and are now lodged in Rio de Janeiro. Could you tell our viewers what were the causes for the loss of most of these documents?
Well, the Goa Inquisition there was a first abolition of the Goa Inquisition, of the court, the tribunal, in 1774. At that moment, all the archives that were in Goa were sent to Lisbon in 1774. 4 years later, the tribunal was restored, and the archive was sent back to Goa, because as it was recreated, the inquisitors needed all the archives back. They needed information again. So the archives was sent back to Goa. Then, more or less 30 years later, a bit less, in 1812, beginning of the 19th century, it was the final abolition of the Inquisition of Goa. Not yet of the Portuguese Inquisition. The Portuguese Inquisition was still working in Portugal, but in Goa in 1812, because there was an agreement with the British, the regent Dom João decided to the abolition of the Inquisition of Goa, and so the viceroy of the time, together with the regent that was at that time in Rio de Janeiro, they had to decide what to do with the archives. And they thought, I mean, people were worried that if the archives were kept, maybe the Inquisition could be recreated once more. So, and it would be too much of a trouble to have it transported completely back to Portugal. To Portugal, it was impossible because it was occupied by the French. And so the viceroy proposed to have it burnt down. Also because it was a very sensitive documentation, because it was related to heresy, to a lot of families that were still there. So he thought that it would be a good idea to have the documents to be burned. So he proposed that to the viceroy, to the regent, Dom João, that was in Rio de Janeiro, and he agreed to that. And he just said that someone who should just choose some important documents to have them kept and send them to the court. And the court was in Rio de Janeiro. And that's why, and those documents were then sent to Rio. And that's why they are still now in the National Library in Rio. In fact, the documents that were chosen were not specifically very important documents or a selection of documents, but in fact only the correspondence that was sent from Lisbon by the Inquisitor General to the inquisitors in Goa. So that's mainly the documents that are now in Rio de Janeiro that can be viewed online. So that's why they are, maybe someday we'll find some other documents, surviving documents from the Inquisition of Goa. But as far as we know those are the only ones that are surviving nowadays.
Right. So the most important ones, let's say the trial records were mostly burnt and
Yes.
destroyed, right?
Yeah.
So
Yes, there
and
are
so
no,
did.
yeah, that's a good point, sorry. The trials, there are some copies that were sent during the whole history of the court in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century that were sent to Lisbon because of legal matters. Some copies, not originals, were sent and are nowadays kept in Torre do Tombo, mixed up with the trials of the Court of Lisbon, of the Tribunal of Lisbon. But some dozens maybe, not more than that.
So
But the original ones, the thousands, were destroyed, were burned down. Some were burned down beforehand in the beginning of the 18th century when there was a Maratha invasion of Goa, and the inquisitors themselves, they were worried or what would have happened to the archives, and then they themselves, they decided to burn down some of the documents. So some of the archive was already destroyed in the beginning of the 18th century in that context.
Okay, so we have like various moments in which these documents were destroyed for various reasons. So towards the end, like towards in the early part of the 19th century, when it was decided, once the Inquisition was abolished, finally it was decided that these documents were should be destroyed. Was there any logic in deciding which to keep and which to destroy?
No, the correspondence speak about someone, a notary of the Inquisition, to choose some important documents. That was more or less the sentence, the phrase that was that is in the document. But what we find nowadays in Rio is a whole series, 7 volumes, no, 9, originally 7 volumes of the correspondence that was sent from Lisbon, from the central organism of the Inquisition, the Inquisitor General and the Conselho Geral, to the Inquisitors of Goa. It's a very interesting documentation, but it depends on what we want to know, of course. So in a certain sense, it's interesting to work with that documentation because it's a seriated documentation. It's all the letters that were sent, that were received by the Inquisitors of Goa, by the central government of the Inquisition. But
Right.
they speak about a whole multitude of subjects regarding
Right.
specific cases, regarding money, regarding the necessity of redoing the Palace of the Inquisition, regarding the health of the inquisitors, anything. So
Right.
you have a lot of different information in these documents.
Right. Right. Uh, my next question is also about a source, and this is a very unique and valuable source for historians like you who study the Goa Inquisition. This is the Repertorio by the Dominican friar João Delgado Figueira. Um, could you let us know what is the Repertorio and why is it an important source?
I don't know if it's possible to show it, to have
Uh,
to show a link or. But in fact, João Delgado Figueira, he wasn't a Dominican at all. He was a
Oh, my
secular
sorry. My
priest.
apologies. Okay.
No, no
Yeah.
problem. Let me just see if how can I
Sure.
share this. And he was the prosecutor of the, you say that in English, right? Of the Inquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And he, when he arrived in Goa, he was sent. He was Portuguese, and he was sent to Goa as a prosecutor. And as a prosecutor, he was responsible. I don't know if you can see already the page.
Yes, yes. It's clearly visible now. Thank you.
He was responsible for the organization of the archive, among other things. And when he arrived in Goa, the archives, he noticed that the archives were not well organized. And there were even some documents that were already in very bad shape, missing pieces and etc. So he decided to reorganize the archive. So he organized the archive, the whole processes, the acts of the trials, and he made a list of all these documents. And this list is the Repertorio. And what I did with some students some years ago is to organize. You can see in this site, we did this. There is in English also the presentation if you need some more details here. And here, if you go in documents, you have here a little example of what was the document itself, the list of all the cases that were tried by the Inquisition of Goa. Not all the cases, because already at that time, in 1623, when he did it, there were already some trials, some processes that were already that had already disappeared because of the weather, because of bad maintenance, and etc. So, but he listed more or less 3,800 of them, and that list is what he sent to Lisbon, of each one of them, organized by year. So you have the name of the person, what was his ethnic, would say, pertenance, like Cristão Velho here. This Esperança Cristã da Terra, so she was a native Christian. Who were the parents? Like the case of this lady here, Esperança, she was a daughter of Gentile parents, baptized adult, native of the island of Diu, of the city of Diu, and married, and also, of course, it always would have, if the person were married or not, the name of the husband or wife, the reason why the person was arrested. She was arrested for bigamy, and what happened with her. She had to abjure the levy. That's what happened with person usually who was arrested for bigamy. Who was the inquisitor who signed the sentence. And then you have the date here and the number of the trial of that said year. She was arrested. She was tried in 1622 because they were having 1623. So this is the kind of document. He listed the 3,800 documents that he found when he arrived in Goa that were tried between 1561 until 1623 when he arrived there. So it's a very important document because you don't have the processes anymore. And here in this site that I organized with some students, we organized them in a Excel and an Access database. So anyone can consult, can now don't need to read that handwriting. They can consult it directly on Excel on Access.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Now you've shown us the document as well, but then you also have the transcription, and the handwriting can be pretty tricky, right? The early modern handwriting, and I can personally vouch for that, knowing how difficult even English handwriting is sometimes. So thanks for the repertorio, how you showed, you gave us a glimpse. Could you also tell us how we can search for these documents in the Rio library?
Sure, I'll share the web page of the Brazilian National Library.
Yes, I can see it. Thank you.
So this is the web page for the Brazilian National Library. So here, if you go to Acervo Digital, here's where it is already, right? And then it opens, and then you have here collections. And then if you go here in collection, you have the very different collections, and there is a collection Inquisition de Goa. And the problem is that it's all mixed up. It's all completely out of order. But anyway, it's a way of, if you just go buscar, meaning search, then they'll all show up here. You have 1,819 registers. As I said, there are 9 volumes. They separated it in 9 volumes, but those 9 volumes are here separated in the document itself. So then when you click in it, the document opens and you can read the document. So that's how it
Okay,
works.
yeah, thank you. Some of these catalogs are not always the easiest to
Yeah,
navigate, but I think more focused study would need someone
yeah.
to
Here you
go
can,
page by page, right?
yeah, you can go by year. Here, anno is year, right? So you can choose a year if you are. Well, it's not very well done, but anyway, at least it's a way
Hmm.
of going there. It's easier than taking the plane nowadays to Rio de Janeiro and to the
Yes, yes,
National
especially in
Library.
the current situation. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And you can search by title if you are searching for something specific. But as I said, some of those documents are letters, and they are very detailed letters that
Hmm.
speaks of tons of different things. So it's
Like the everyday issues that
yeah,
come
yeah,
up in the functioning of the
yeah.
tribunal, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's
Hmm.
very general, but you can search by names or dates or something.
Hmm.
So that's the way to do it.
So having given a sense of what the document looks like, what it is, how it is structured, uh, how do you, how should one use it? Like, in what way can a historian use it? We know that it is not the whole data. It's just a fragment. It's a
Mhm.
summary or an abstract, or whatever you might call it. So, what's the larger picture? How can we draw a larger picture out of
Mm,
this source, a very important source, as you
mm.
say?
Well, until now, it was very difficult to use it because, as I said, it is organized by year and by gender. First men, and then completely separated women. And
Hmm.
so you have all the men that were sentenced, tried in 1651, 1561, then 1562, etc., etc. Um, so it's not by kind of crime, by region, by year, because you have in different places all those years. Um, so putting all together in a database, it's possible to try to recompose the autos da fé, for instance. How many people were sentenced together in an auto da fé in Goa? Strangely, they seem to have been very small.
So, auto da fe is the burning at the stake, right?
No, 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 no. Auto da fé
Oh,
is the reading of the penances, of the sentences, of the, how do you say that? Of the verdicts, of the,
okay.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
Auto da fé, in fact, is the mainly is the reading of the verdict and of the penances of all the people. Nowadays, we use auto da fe as a synonym of bonfire. But at that time, it was not the case. Auto da fe was a very long ceremony that started with a procession. And after the procession, there was a reading of a sermon, a preaching of a sermon. And then there was a reading of the whole verdict and penance of every person that was there at this ceremony. And after that, those people suffered their penances. Those who there would be whipped, of course, not in the church or in the ceremony. That would happen afterwards, or go to or to the bonfire, but that would be only a very small percentage usually. Most part of them would have spiritual penances and financiary, monetary penances.
Okay.
Sometimes banishment also, and forced labor.
Okay. So earlier you said there were surprisingly less auto da fes. What does that mean? Could you just quickly explain?
Less people in autos da fe than in Portugal. In Lisbon, autos da fe I'm speaking in 16th and 17th century, and beginning 17th century. So I don't know if that's because a part of the documentation had already disappeared when João Delgado Figueira arrived in Goa in 1623. Or another possibility is that they decided to do small autos da fe, not to shock people in Goa. In Lisbon, the autos da fe in the 16th century were a grandiose ceremony. Well, in Goa also, they were to show how the Inquisition was capable of bringing back to Catholicism and to Orthodoxy those heretics. So it was really a joyous ceremony, to be a joyous ceremony, of course, to the community as a whole, because they were bringing back, I mean, theoretically, bringing back to the fold those people that were going to hell. So that was the sense of auto da fe. It was an act of faith. So that was the ceremony. But everybody in Lisbon or in Portugal, most of the people, I mean, well, of course, we don't have percentages, it's impossible, but would take part in that. In Goa, a big part of the population, mostly in the 16th century, was still not Catholic. If they would see, and there are letters from inquisitors and from Lisbon to the inquisitors in Goa, worried about this question. What would all these people that they wanted to convert think if they would see those people being punished in that way? So small autos da fe could be maybe a way of being in a certain way discreet regarding the population around.
Right. Yeah, and I think these two possibilities need to be considered further, right? When we think about the Goa Inquisition, I want to ask you about your work on the Inquisition in Brazil and in Latin America. Uh, could you give us a sense of the main developments in the historiography of the Inquisition in Brazil? What are the dominant models scholars today use to understand the history of the Inquisition there in Brazil?
Well, there is, as for Portugal, here in Brazil, the studies um, on the Inquisition in the last, well, in the mid 20th century was more centered in the history of New Christians, meaning the descendants of the Jews that were converted in the end of the 15th century in Portugal. And so that was the main production regarding the Inquisition in Brazil in the mid 20th century was related to New Christians. And so by the end of the 20th century, the last quarter maybe of the 20th century, social history had a very important part discovered, would say, the Inquisition sources, the Inquisition trials. But if we arrive more to the end of the 20th century, the last quarter of the 20th century, with the influence of social history, we can see that people started to see the interest of the inquisitorial sources, of inquisitorial trials for the history of for social history. And so we started to have very important studies regarding sorcery, for instance, witchcraft, European witchcraft, but also what was called witchcraft, but in fact were African ceremonies and religion that were identified by the inquisitors or by the church as witchcraft. Also sexual transgressions, and so there by the 1980s and 1990s, we have very important works on social history that are based on inquisitorial sources. They are not specifically about the Inquisition, but they are based on inquisitorial sources. More recently, we started to have interest on the structure and on the functioning, on the operation of the Inquisition, how it worked, in the interaction with of the Inquisition with other institutions, mainly the secular church, meaning the bishops and the bishops' tribunals and the officers of the bishops of the tribunals of the bishops. Also, of course, relations of the Inquisition with regular orders. So that's more or less the kind of studies that we're having more recently. And another thing that's been also very important already since the end of the last century is to study the Inquisition not only as a repressive institution, meaning the influence of the Inquisition in society went beyond repression, because the Inquisition had as officers not only inquisitors, but also lay people that worked for them, called familiares, the familiares de Inquisição. And it was a way of the Inquisition to have a very important support, very generally in the society. And in exchange, they would give to these people more or less a certificate of purity of blood. So for those people, it would be a way of showing that they were better in a certain way than those people that were descendants of the Jews or of the Muslim, the Moors, or the Moriscos, or of the Black people, or of the Indians, and or of the Hindus in India also. So it was a very important way in which the Inquisition had influence over the society, not only with repression, but also with this with the regulation of the attribution of the certificate of blood purity, the familiaris, the certificate of familiaris. And so there are a lot of studies being done in Brazil regarding how it worked. Not only in Brazil, also in Portugal. In fact, the main studies started in Portugal already in the 1980s and now also in Brazil.
Right, and thanks for the sense. I wanted to know how you view the development of the scholarship on the Goa Inquisition. Could you give our viewers a sense of the important developments the same way as you talked about in Brazil?
Well, the studies of the on the Goa Inquisition, of course, you have the very important studies though done by Antonio Baião in the beginning of the 20th century. But the main developments are much more recent, right? But because of the sources, because it's very different, the sources that we have regarding Brazil, regarding Portugal, are are of a different kind than those regarding Portugal of Goa, or the Estado da Índia in general. So because of those sources, maybe because of the Repertorio, many of the studies done on the Goa Inquisition in the 20th century, or in the mid and in the second half of the 20th century, were done using the Repertorio. And the Repertorio relates only to the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. And so most of these studies relate to this period and to the history of the new Christians, of the descendants of the Jews. Because at that period, in the the beginning of the 16th, 17th century, the main target of the Goa Inquisition was still the people that were tried by for Judaism. But nowadays, because of disponibility of the documents in Rio de Janeiro, the library in Rio, but also because of some documents that are also available in Portugal, there are some other studies that are also done regarding the 18th century and the late 17th century. And those studies shows a completely different situation. And so it's much more recently that are being done, studies are being done regarding the action of the Goa Inquisition, or more thoroughly regarding the local population, population of Indian, Hindu, and Muslim origin, mostly. And so those studies are more recent. Regarding the persecution of crypto-Hinduism, we would say it that way, the persecution of local ceremonies. Also, there are some studies that are being done to study the situation of slaves and the slave trade in East Africa and South Asia. Not the Repertorio, but also some other documents. And so those are more or less the kind of, and also, of course, in parallel of what's being done in Brazil and also in Portugal, to study and understand the structure and the functioning of the Goa Inquisition. Because one thing that it's very important to understand, and that's something that I stress all the time, is that the documentation of the Inquisition is a very important documentation to understand the institution itself. So the easiest thing that we can do with this documentation is to understand how it worked. After we understand how it worked, we can understand more easily and more thoroughly and with more knowledge, more knowledgeably, its influence and its impact.
Right. So what you're saying is that we need to understand the institution as such, its structures first thoroughly, so that we have a solid base to understand how it functioned in society, right?
Yes, because the documents that it created, the processes, the trials were done, were created for a specific end, that was to judge someone. Those trials were not done as a sociological document,
Right, right.
right?
Right, right. So I think this is a good point to turn to my next question, right? In your writings, you stress about the importance of local conditions in Goa, in which the Inquisition operated. The Inquisition had to adapt to the Portuguese Empire, uh, and the fact that the Portuguese Empire was spread out, right, across Asia,
Mhm.
as well as the local Goan conditions in the villages, which made it hard to impose its rules that were made in Europe. What are these local conditions that you can shed light on, uh, and are they and and what is the importance of these local conditions when we talk about the history of the Inquisition?
Mm. Well, there is, well, different specialists has shown how the Inquisition adapted to local conditions. Giuseppe Marcocci described, for instance, the Inquisition of Goa as a border inquisition or as a borderland inquisition. And I think it's a very interesting concept to be used to understand the Inquisition, the Goan Inquisition, as to understand the Inquisition when it acted in North Africa, for instance. It's completely different than the Inquisition in Portugal, or even maybe the Inquisition in Brazil, maybe sometimes. But uh, how can we understand this idea of borderland inquisition that Marcocci uses? The thing is that differently than what was the Inquisition acting in Portugal or in Spain, is that the Inquisition in Goa had to take into account that there were uh, uh, there were very powerful neighbors just across the river. I mean, the territory was very small, and there were, there were people could come and go with quite with some ease between the Catholic territory, the territory in which the Inquisition had jurisdiction, and territories in which it had none jurisdiction at all. So in many moments, mainly in the beginning of the action of the Inquisition in Goa, and as I told already, they were advised by Lisbon not to use all the legal acts that they could that could be used against the indicted. They had to take into account the image that they would pass to the people that were there. And so they had to take those conditions into account. And there is what a very specific, there are a lot of specific things that happened in Goa that didn't happen anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Something that shows this adaptation for the good, I would say, and some others that would show it for the bad. I don't know if you say that in English, but anyway. For instance, regarding canon law, someone that would commit a crime, a heretic crime twice, in the second crime, the second episode, there would be no possibility of reintegration to the church. The person had to be directly sent to the bonfire. If someone committed a heresy, if he did penance, then he was integrated. In a second episode, he would be directly sent to the bonfire. the Portuguese Inquisition obtained from the Pope in 1599, so more or less 40 years after the foundation, after a long negotiation, that converted people from India, Gentiles and infidels, that's what say the bull, could be reconciled to the church more than once. So they wouldn't be sent directly to the bonfire after a second delict, a second heresy, I would say.
Mm.
If they were arrested a second time for the same heresy, they wouldn't be sent directly to the bonfire. They could be reconciled a second time, and maybe even a third time.
Right, right, and it seems that
So
this sort of
that's a very specific thing, adaptation to the Indian condition. It was
conditions.
already used
Uh-huh.
in North Africa regarding people that of Muslim origin.
I think there are just two issues that strike me over here. One is the issue of politics, that politics in the sense that there are neighboring powers, just
Mhm.
as you said, just across the river, but also the politics of empire, like the Portuguese Empire spread across the whole world. So the first question that I want you to think about is. What's the importance of empire in the study of the Inquisition? And
Mhm.
secondly, when you talk about adaptability, what then is the nature of violence in the Goan case?
Well, regarding that, there is another adaptation that I think it's important to show, because I say this seems to show the Inquisition very concerned with the life of those people. But for instance, there is another specific characteristic of the Goa tribunal regarding this borderland nature of it, is that usually the Inquisition, that's something that's very, that's of the nature of Inquisition, is that Inquisition has had jurisdiction over baptized people. The Inquisition tried Christians. That was the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. And so in Europe, they would very, very, very rarely judge, arrest people that were not baptized. If there was a Jew that were trying to reconvert people, that Jews that had converted to Catholicism, they would maybe arrest that person, right? But that was very, very rare. In India, after not very long, that became very frequent. These trials against non-Christians were one of the most unique characteristics of the Indian tribunal. The primary objective of those trials to punish Hindus and Muslims that try to impede the conversion of other Hindus and Muslims to Catholicism, right? Or they went or try to bring them back to their religion of origin, right? Or also because after a while, the Inquisition also had a power of police, I would say, to forbid rituals, Hindu rituals and cults in Portuguese lands. And if they got people doing like a marriage, for instance, they could arrest those people. So those are something that was completely different than what happened in Portugal. Of course, those people wouldn't be tortured for that, right? They would have to pay a fine. They would have to pay things like that. And what may have happened was that they would choose maybe to convert instead of paying this fine, of being deported, maybe. But those are things that still have to be studied more in detail, because of the things that happened more frequently in the 18th century and in the late 17th century, and things that have to be studied much more in detail. But that's also the things that regarding your last question, is that what we have The information that we get through the documents of the Inquisition are, how to say, a partial view of the situation, right? It shows what was considered the anomalies. So it's not the majority. Well, it's difficult to know the proportion of things, of course, but we could think that was not. It was just a part of the situation of what happened in Goa, and what we see. That is about regarding violence, right? Can you say that
Yeah.
again?
So,
How was
so
it?
what I wanted to, like, you talked about punishment, you talked about fines, and
Mm-hmm.
so what's the nature of like, what as a historian would you think, given the present, given the limitations of sources and everything, what's a generalization that you as a historian would make about the nature of violence in the Goa case?
Mm-hmm. Well, but it depends what you mean by nature. What kind of what are the variants you're talking about, right? Of course, there was religious violence, cultural violence, economic violence because there were fines. But of course, the Inquisition was a repressive institution that meant to take deviants legally back to the fold, or to maintain those that were not Catholic completely separated from the Catholic. That was something that historiography have sometimes some difficulty to understand the situation in Goa, because sometimes historiography, Portuguese historiography, I think, has the tendency to have an image of Goa as a completely Catholic territory. I mean, the Portuguese territories as completely Catholic. But when we see English historiography, or when you see documents, you see that at least in the 18th century, it was not the case. You have a lot of non-Catholic important merchants and families living in those territories and having an important role in the Estado da Índia in a certain way. So it's difficult to see, to understand how the Inquisition could really keep separated Catholics from non-Catholics. And that was in the late 17th century, and during the whole 18th century, it was a huge fight during between the viceroy, some viceroys, the archbishop, and the inquisitors to the weight that the religion and the economy should have in the politics. And the king in Portugal would try to maintain some balance from time to time
Right,
in those
right.
politics.
Right, and then I think that that kind of negotiation is important to consider, right? And it's not, and one can't simply assume that religion was the the driving force in the Portuguese Empire at that time. So I want to talk to you a bit about Christianization as well. Like, and this is a topic that is linked with the Inquisition, and you do talk about the Christianization of Goa briefly, and even Portuguese Asia in a more general sense in your studies. But we know that the historiography of conversion is a vast one. So my question to you is how important, or how can the study of surviving inquisitorial documents help in understanding the spread of Catholicism in Goa or in Portuguese Asia?
Well, as I said, as I said, it's difficult to give a complete to have a complete view using those documents. It's a
Mm,
partial view of the situation. As
mm,
I said, it shows some anomalies. It also shows, as I was saying, that the church felt always threatened by the Hindus and their influence in the society around, because they're always trying to control what they were doing, and they were always concerned with the influence they could have on the person, on those that were converted recently or not so recently, right? Uh, so it's more that kind of things that I think we can see. The documents of the Inquisition don't give numbers, so it's hard to use them to give some weight on how the Christianization was going and was working in Goa. So as I was saying, I'm not a specialist on the matters of Christianization,
mm,
and more details on the numbers and all the different aldeias and 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 the paces of the Christianization and conversion uh, of those lands. So I cannot speak with a lot of prior of
mm.
um, knowledge of that.
Right, right. And I also wanted to ask you about like A.K. Priyolka's work because he also links
Mm-hmm.
Christianization with the Inquisition. But as
Mm-hmm.
you said, I'm not going to press the issue because, as you said, you're not really in a position to talk about it. But still, I mean, if you can feel free to
Sure.
comment if you want.
Yeah, Priyolka, well, it's an important book for some points, but for some other points, there are some problems there. Regarding the question of Christianization of Goa, he speaks of, let me see it, I have it here. He speaks uh, of he put questions and answers, right? He speaks of conversions from convictions or for convenience or for by force.
Mm,
I think, I don't know if those are the right questions to be posed for a situation of conversion in 16th century, of situation of conversion of what was felt and used as religion in India or even in
mm,
Portugal at that time. Of course, you had models of conversion of even in 16th, some models that still works nowadays and worked at the time of Priyolka, that someone would be illuminated, would have a revelation and would convert. That is the perfect model of conversion, right? And I mean, this could be thought as ideal or not,
yeah, but it doesn't
but
doesn't really work in
but
practice, right?
that in practice that not always work.
Mm,
And in reality, you could always put a little bit of convenience too, and that would work in any situation, not only to Catholicism but to any other religion or situation, right? So of course there were forced conversions in around Goa and in Portuguese India. That's for sure. Nobody could deny that. Uh, there were unprepared conversions, mainly in the beginning. I mean, if you can read any serious studies regarding conversions, you can see that. But also, uh, there were uh, there were also missions. There were missionaries that were, we could think, worried to convert seriously those people to what would be considered Catholicism at that time, right? So I think he made a very shallow understanding of what conversion was and is in that sense.
So uh, I wanted to talk to you about more about the trial records.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in your studies, like you have worked a lot on the procedure that was followed, right? And you are and you believe that, and I think you're right about knowing about the institutional structure. So you speak about the methods the inquisitors used to establish proof. Um, how rigorous were these methods, and what problems did the inquisitors encounter uh, in this method?
Well, those methods were very rigorous. You cannot say they weren't rigorous, but they were rigorous regarding specific rules. They are not our rules nowadays, are not the rules that are followed by tribunals nowadays. So, of course, we cannot consider them rigorous regarding uh, uh, how can say regarding justice. Are they just? Are they following justice? You cannot say that, of course, because they are following their notion of justice. And more than a notion of justice, you have to remember that those inquisitors, in Go it was a bit different, but you have to see, I think, the Portuguese Inquisition as a whole, and the early modern Inquisition of the early modern times as a whole, the Iberian Inquisition. They were, they studied law most of the time. They were jurists. They studied canon law. So they were prepared to follow specific path and specific ways of judging, right? So they follow specific rules and bylaws of the legal system of the time. There was the law of proof. There was a specific system. And as they were judging heresy, and heresy was considered the most dangerous crime they would think, that was related to lesa majestatis, would be the same thing as killing the king. They could use extraordinary methods to judge and to deseal, to discover the heresy. So they could use specific, very specific methods that could not be used in a regular secular courts or even in the bishop's courts. What were those methods? The procedure was completely under secret. They didn't know who were denouncing them, what were they are being denounced of. In the other procedures, after a while, people would know what were they are being denounced of and who were denouncing them. And there were also a different accountability of the testimonies that were being that were used against them. It's a very complicated thing, not complicated, but it's a very detailed thing, annoying of legal history that is not the case, I think, of going into detail here. The thing is that that kind of thing, the secret and the way of accounting those testimonies would open the possibility very widely to false testimonies. So the false testimonies, false accusations was endemic in the Portuguese Inquisition, was a real problem that the inquisitors had to face. And that appears all the time in the documentation, not the Go Inquisition, but in the Portuguese Inquisition as a whole, since the 16th century. Of course, I'm saying that is a problem for the inquisitors, but it was a much harsher problems for the persons that were arrested, because they could end at the bonfire because of that, right? Those indicted could face false proofs against them. and how they could relate to that. They didn't know who were denouncing them. They would just know that someone was denouncing them for heresy. You've been denounced of doing some heresies in a certain period, somewhere that we cannot say. And the person should make exame de consciência and discover by himself what those denunciations were and confess them. And so that was the big problem of the way inquisitors judged in Portugal. And that was one of the questions, one of the things for which the Portuguese Inquisition as a whole was accused during very different moments of its history in the 17th century and in the 18th century.
And I believe that the circumstances in which that you just described, the record is being created, could itself also create a methodological problem for the historian, right? Like, how can a historian be sure of what he or she is, asserting on the basis of those documents? So, is there a way, have you thought about this issue, or have you dealt with this problem? Is there a way how you can solve it? Do you use some other kind of sources? How do you navigate that?
No, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. But the sources are nevertheless reliable in a certain way, because there are some processes where the person maintained that he wasn't guilty, and that he could produce proof that he was a good Christian, and then he was released. Not everybody that was arrested by the Inquisition was convicted to the bonfire. It happened also that the inquisitors could have 2 testimonies against someone, but not the 7 testimonies that they needed to send someone to the bonfire. So this person wouldn't have a very harsh punishment, but only some spiritual penances, for instance. So the system worked. It was a very, very, how to say it? Very, how the word misses me. Even in Portuguese,
it had its own checks and balances in its own flawed ways. Is that what you're trying to express?
But not only that, but it was very mean. Was not the word, but it's more or less that, because perverse was the word I would use.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this is, I'm not being very, also meaning, sorry. I'm using some strong words here, but I think we can categorize the system, because it was a way of putting the people in a corner, right? And it's very difficult for them to
get out of it.
To get out, yeah.
Right, and
without confessing. So people would do other false confessions and false denunciations.
Right.
And so that would go as a snowball in many cases.
Right. No, and point well taken about, all these issues that we need to consider about. I have one final question, and I wanted to know what you're working on currently and what we can expect to read from you in the near future. So if you could just give us a brief glimpse before I let you off, and it's been a quite a long interview, and so you could just give us a brief sense of how what are you
Well,
doing?
I just told you about it. It's more or less, it's about this, how these problems regarding the way the legal system worked inside the Inquisition got people inside the Inquisition itself, inquisitors itself, got insatisfaction with it, and that there were some reforms that were done under the Marquis of Pombal in 1774. Right, in 1774, the Inquisition, the Tribunal of Go was abolished, but there was a whole new bylaw that was written for in 1773 in the Inquisition of Portugal. So it transformed a little bit the way the trials were judged. And usually people say that was purely the influence of the Illustration, of Illuminism. What I say, I wrote a book about this. What I say is that there was also influence of the insatisfaction of the inquisitors themselves, because they knew that what they were doing was unjust too. Some of them. There were different factions inside Inquisition by the 1730s, 1740s.
Right.
Some of them wanted to follow those rules strictly as they were doing, and some others were doing it in a certain way to make the judgment even more perverse, because they were doing it more easily, in fact. Not to release the people, but to make the trial goes more easily. And the trials show that, and there are some correspondence between the inquisitors that shows that too.
Right. So that sounds fascinating, and I'll keep an eye out for when that gets published.
I'll let you know.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Feitler, for
You're welcome.
giving us a sense of what the why Brazilian scholars got interested, how certain documents, for some reason, reached Rio de Janeiro. Thank you also for giving us a very nuanced view of the procedure, of the Inquisition, of the trials, of how the victims were tried on and persecuted, and also of the importance of looking at the local conditions. So thank you once again for your time, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.